Joseph Mengele was an SS officer and physician in Auschwitz concentration camp during World War II. Mengele was an infamous member of the team of doctors responsible for the selection of victims to be killed in the gas chambers and for performing deadly human experiments on prisoners. Arrivals deemed able to work and were admitted into the camp, and those deemed unfit for labor were immediately killed in the gas chambers. Nazi Germany performed human experimentation on large numbers of prisoners, including children. Largely Jews from across Europe, but also Romani, Sinti, ethnic Poles, Soviet POWs, and disabled German prisoners were forced into participating. They did not and were not willing to volunteer, and no consent was given for the procedures. Typically, the experiments resulted in death, trauma, disfigurement, or permanent disability, and as such are considered as examples of medical torture. There are 3 categories of experiments. The first category consists of experiments that aims to help the survival of military aviation personnel. In Davao, physicians conducted high-altitude experiments using low-pressure chambers to determine the maximum altitude from which crews of damaged aircraft could parachute to safety. Scientists there carried out so-called freezing experiments using prisoners to find treatments for hypothermia. They also used prisoners to test various methods of making seawater drinkable. The second category of experimentation is focused on developing and testing pharmaceuticals and treatments for the injuries and illnesses in which German troops encountered in the field. Inside concentration camps, scientists tested vaccines and serums for the prevention and treatment of contagious diseases. This includes malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, yellow fever, and hepatitis. The Ravensbrück camp was a site of bone grafting experiments and experiments to test the effectiveness of newly developed sulfenamide drugs. At Natzweiler and Sachsenhausen, prisoners were exposed to phosgene and mustard gas in order to test possible antidotes. The third category of medical experimentation was to seek an advance in the racial and ideological tenets of the Nazi worldview. The most infamous were the experiments of Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz. Mengele conducted a medical experiment on twins. He also directed serological experiments on gypsies, as did Werner Fechscher at Sachsenhausen, in order to determine how different races withstood various different contagious diseases. The research of August Hirt at Strasbourg University also intended to establish the Jewish racial inferiority. Many of the subjects died as a result of the experiments conducted by the Nazis, while many others were executed after the tests were completed and the study of the effects were post-mortem. Those who survived were often left mutilated, suffered permanent disability, weakened bodies, and mental distress. On August 19th of 1947, the doctors captured by Allied forces were put to trial in the United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al., commonly known as the Doctors' Trial. At the trial, several of the doctors argued in their defense that there was no international law regarding medical experimentation. In response, doctors Leo Alexander and Andrew Conway Ivy drafted a 10-point memorandum entitled Permissible Medical Experiment that went on to be known as the Nuremberg Code, set as a result of the subsequent Nuremberg trials at the end of the Second World War. The code calls for such standards as voluntary consent of patients, avoidance of unnecessary pain and suffering, and that there must be a belief of experimentation that will not end in death or disability.